Translators are the shadow heroes of literature, the often forgotten instruments that make it possible for different cultures to talk to one another. They are the ones who enabled us to understand that no matter wherever we are from, we're all one. And with this, I will take the opportunity to introduce our esteemed panel for this session. Ms. Saskya Jain, educated at Berlin's Free University and Columbia University, New York, she holds a master's degree in fiction from Boston University. She was the recipient of the Florence Engel Randall Award for Fiction and the Robert Pinsky Global Fellowship for Travel to Iran. One of her short stories was a finalist in 2011 Asian American Short Story Contest, and her writing has appeared in Literary Imagination, Hyphen Magazine, and The Baffler. Shri Ashok Vajpeyi is a Hindi poet critic, translator, editor, and cultural activist, and is a major cultural figure of India. With more than 13 books of poetry, 10 of criticism in Hindi, and 4 books on art in English to his credit, he is widely recognized as an outstanding promoter of culture and innovative institution builder. Srimati Bhawana Somaaya, an eminent commentator on Indian cinema, she is the recipient of several prestigious awards and has contributed to columns to various publications like The Observer, The Afternoon, Janmabhoomi, Pravasi, and The Hindu. Bhavana Somaaya has been on the advisory panel of CBFC. She has to her credit 9 books in a span of 10 years. She is currently the creative consultant to Enlighten Films and their website Dear Cinema. She does a weekly film review on a Sunday show on 92.7 Big FM. She has 2 books in the pipeline. She has also translated a book on Krishna from Gujarati to English. Dr. C.N. Ramachandran, he is an eminent critic and has worked in several countries. He was a professor of English in Mangalore University. His autobiography released recently and was very well received. He writes in Kannada and English and has more than 10 books to his credit. He is also the recipient of Karnataka Sahitya Academy Award. I would also like to introduce the moderator for this session, Srimati Keerti Ramachandra. She is a teacher by training, aptitude, and inclination, a translator by virtue of being multilingual. She now works as a freelance fiction editor and translator. Her translations, primarily of short fiction from Kannada, Marathi, and Hindi, have appeared in several anthologies and journals. She has won the Katha Eke Ramanujan Award for translation. She has also translated from Marathi Vishwas Patil's fictionalized biography of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's Mahanayak and co-translated Joginder Paul's collection of short stories, The Dying Sun. Her translation of Vishwas Patil's highly acclaimed Marathi novel, A Dirge of the Damned, is due to be released by the end of this year, as also Atma Katha, Sri Madhu Limaya's autobiography. I would now request the moderator, Srimati Ramachandran, to continue the proceedings.
Thank you, Jyothi. I hope I got your name right.
Yes.
Okay. If you walk down any street of any city or town in India today, you find that people are engaging with the world around them in more than one language simultaneously. If not bilingual, most of us multilingual, and we're constantly switching between languages, though we do have one dominant language in which we think. Now, when we convey what we think in one language into the words of another, what are we doing but translating? It's not only word equivalents that we translate, though. To give you a little anecdote, when I first moved to Delhi, I only knew the tum form of address, because in my language, that was what I knew, tumi, which is in Marathi. When I spoke to people and I said tum, I didn't realize I was being rude, and because I was not familiar with the aap form. Finally, when somebody said, tum Madrasi ho, and I said, very sheepishly, because we had moved to Delhi from Chennai, and he said, theek hai, chalega. So you see, it was not just the words, when I used the second person pronoun to address people, it was not just the word that I was translating, I was transferring a whole cultural ethos, my own, into a language which was unfamiliar to me and to a culture. So if translating everyday words carry so much weight, imagine what it's like translating literary texts where one has to carry across an ethos and a culture into new linguistic territory. It's an onerous task. So then why do we translate at all? Is it to fulfill some creative urge? Because yes, translation is an extremely creative activity. Is it the next best thing to writing your own novel, story, or poem? Or is it a desire to share the joyous experience of having read a text to a larger with a larger readership? We often hear the lament, there are very few quality translations of literature from the bhashas, the Indian languages. What do they mean by quality translations? Can quality be defined? Can it be quantified? Are there any criteria for evaluating a translation? Translation, it is said, is an activity anchored in practice. One learns on the job. So then, can translation be taught? Is it necessary to know the theories of translation in order to be a translator? What then does make a good translator? With a panel of eminent translators we have here, let's ask them to share their experience of translating with us, to describe for us the joy and the despair, the challenge and the anguish, as they dealt with knotty issues of language and structure, and then the moments of triumph and elation when they had built for their readers a beautiful bridge into another literature. May I request Dr. Ramachandran to make the opening statements, please?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I normally translate from my mother tongue, Kannada, to English, the language which I took up for my professional teaching. And therefore, I will be exclusively speaking of the problems that arise when I try to translate from Kannada to English. Okay? And since the time is very short, I shall take up just a few instances in which I faced certain problems and I came up with my own ad hoc answers. But I am not sure whether they are the right answers or whether the problems were the right problems that I came up with. Anyway, here they are. I love, in addition to Kannada literature and English literature, Sanskrit literature also. And occasionally, I translate from Sanskrit to English. Whether it's from Kannada to English, or Hindi to English, or Sanskrit to English, the first problem is, what do we do about connotations? Connotation, or dhvani, is language, culture specific. What do we do? Do we just give a paraphrase? Or do we try to bring out the connotation also in English? And if we try to do, what are the problems? Let me take just an example of a Sanskrit poem, a quatrain, and it is written by a woman called Bhava, I believe in the 12th century or something. I won't read the entire stanza, but I shall give you the paraphrasable meaning, which is very simple. The poem says, the speaker is a woman, she's talking about her life and love and all that, and she says, the paraphrasable meaning, initially our bodies became inseparable. Tatha bhoot asmakam prathamam avibhinna tanurivam. Then we became lovers. Tatonutvam preya ahamapi hatasha priyatama. Now we are husband and wife. Idanim nathastvam vayamapi kalatram kimaparam. What else is there to be said? Then comes the sentence, I have indeed tasted the hard fruits of life. Mayaptam prananam kulisha katinanam phalamidam. Somehow the paraphrasable meaning doesn't make any sense. Here is a woman who is saying that she loved a person and he loved her and then they got married to each other. Then what's there to complain about? Somehow there seems to be something wrong in the paraphrasable poem. when we begin to think it over, we realize that perhaps she wants to say something else other than what the paraphrase tells us. And her real meaning or the connotation or dhvani is centered around two words, Natha and Collateral. She says, we were lovers and our bodies also met. They got united. Now we have become husband and wife. And the words she uses are Natha and Collateral. Etymologically, Natha means Lord, Master, one who wields authority. And Collateral means one whose waist is bent, working and working and working. Okay? Therefore, perhaps what she is saying is, both the terms connote subservience imposed on the woman by marriage and or the sexual exploitation by her husband. Collateral, the waist-bent woman. How do we communicate these ripples of dhvani without footnotes? Giving footnotes is easy, but without footnotes, could we do something? My attempt goes like this. Unfortunately, this is how it happened. First, our two bodies became one, indistinguishable. Then, you became my lover. Now, you are my husband, the master. And I, your wife, waist-bent, subservient. What else is there to be said? These are the fruits of my heart, as hard as Indra's Vajra. The translation is explanatory, but it explicates, I am sure, what is implicit in the original poem. In other words, we cannot totally ignore the connotations or the dhvani, and we should try one thing or another, one way or another, to communicate that meaning to the implied reader of the translation. The second problem of all Indian languages, while translating a work in those languages to English, is one of synonyms. Since most of the Indian languages borrow their vocabulary from Sanskrit, there are numberless synonyms for each. Even if we take the great Ramayana and we are thinking of the woman called Sita, it isn't as simple as that. Sometimes she becomes Janakaje, sometimes she becomes Bhumije. I mean, at least there are 24 different synonyms for Sita. While translating, what do we do with these synonyms? Are they useless? Shall we just say Sita throughout and Rama throughout? Or shall we find out why a particular synonym is used in a particular sense? Let me take an example which gave me at least 1 or 2 sleepless nights. I was translating a part of the famous version of Mahabharata, a medieval version, by a great poet called Kumaravyasa. And when he describes the situation in which Dharmaraya has played dice, has lost everything, and even his wife he has put at stake and he has lost, and then Draupadi is brought to the court, and then she is put to shame, dishonored and all that. At that time, the poet says, Bhima got so angry that he wanted to burn the hands of Dharmaraya, who played dice and thus made Draupadi, his wife also, a subservient woman. At that time, Arjuna, sitting quietly there, pacifies Bhima. Hey, calm down. And I'm quoting just one line which appears to me so important. He says, quiet down, my brother. I'm reading the Kannada line, just one line. E nitambiniyadiyada samasta vastugolu e narendrange samave. Let me read it again. E nitambiniyadiyada samasta vastugolu e narendrange samave. In paraphrase, it's a very simple statement. All the things on this earth put together, including this woman, aren't equal to our king, that is Dharmaraya. Therefore, calm down, nothing has gone wrong. But then, there is no word called Draupadi, there is no word meaning Draupadi used there. There's a strange word used, Nitambini. And if you go to the etymology of the word, you will realize, pardon me for explaining it, you will realize that it connotes a woman with well-developed rump. Let me use that slang, begging your pardon. Well-developed rump. Now the question is, why does such a great poet in a great epic use such a slang term? There lies his poetic genius. What he is pointing out using that word Nitambini, instead of any other word that he could have used for Draupadi, Agni Kanya he could have said. He says Nitambini, a woman with well-developed rump. That shows that here is the poet pointing out to us that this woman Draupadi is just an object of sex for her husbands. Nothing else. She is not a woman, an object of sex. And therefore, it doesn't matter to them what happens to this particular woman. I mean, if we want to develop this, we can say that it's a great, great feminist concern on the part of the poet for Draupadi or any other woman in that situation. But the point is, each word, each synonym has its own special connotation, special dhwani, and we have to catch it. Lastly, 2 more minutes. Lastly, a translator works under rival, competing claims. Claims of the text and the claims of the implied reader. Both of them want total fidelity from the translator. I was translating, along with my friend Padma Sharma, this book, that is B.V. Karan's autobiography. And I think we took about a year and a half. We took it very seriously, and then we showed it to others, and then they said it was fine. We sent it to NSD as per our contract. They accepted it. And finally, one day, when it was about to, as I heard, when it was about to go to the publishing house, there came a phone call. What is Akagi? I said, Akagi is the term used by Corinth to mean the great director Ibrahim El-Qazi. Then how do you write him as Alakaji in Kannada? He writes it as Alakaji, A-L-A-K-A-J-I. He explains it. Corinth explains it later. No, J-I. He explains it later that he came to know later that his name was El-Qazi, K-A-Z-I, but somehow calling him Alakaji, like Sundarji or Ramaji, made him very familiar and come very close to his heart. Therefore, throughout his stay there, Karan's stay there in Delhi, he used to call the great director, Ibrahim El-Qazi, Alakaji. We thought it was self-explanatory and we retained it. And the NSD people found fault with it. If you cannot know the pronunciation and the correct spelling of this great director, I don't think the book translated by you is worth publishing. They held up the publication, believe me, for almost a year. Then, of course, there was a series of meetings and discussions, arguments and compromises. And finally, I think last year or so, the book was published. That's a different issue. The point I'm raising is this. Whom should a translator show complete fidelity to? Is it to the text? Is it to the writer? Or should he just forget both and just think of what he would do in a similar situation? I don't know. I haven't found any answers. I tried, or my friend Padma Sharma and I, both of us tried to be true to the writer. Karan's style, Karan's love for Ibrahim El-Qazi, and Karan's way of putting it. And we were found wrong. Should we be true to the text or should we be true to the reader? I don't know. But anyway, after all, a translator is only a bridge. He is neither here nor there. But Bridge is the only way of going from one place to the other, reaching the other reader, the other culture, and the other experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ramachandran. I know that these are very weighty issues which most of us as translators have had to contend with. And now we'll have Saskya Jain to make her presentation because she translates from German into English. And she writes in English. If we'd like to know if she has had similar problems, whether of synonyms or whether of connotations, and where the fidelity to whom. Saskia?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is the mic on?
No, we can't.
Maybe this is the better. Yes. Yes. Thank you very much. Also for the introduction. Maybe just to sort of provide the transition, I would just like to begin on a slightly personal note. I think I'm the only one here translating not from an Indian language, but from German into English, even though I myself, I grew up in Delhi, I'm from Delhi. And like, as you mentioned yourself, and like many of you in the audience, I too grew up with several languages at home, speaking sort of much English, much German, because my mother's German, Hindi, some Gujarati, because my father is Gujarati speaking. And so we're all very used to these acts of translation in our daily lives. And I think in order to talk about translation between different languages and whether or not it can build bridges, we could also acknowledge the linguistic hybridity within a single language, which mirrors the diversity within a community. So you have different social classes and age groups, gender, locations, time periods that determine what language we use, even within a single language. So just to give you an example, for example, a middle-class boy growing up in Delhi today will speak a very different kind of Hindi than an older woman, say in Benares, would have done 100 years ago. And the same parallel examples could be found for any language, English, German, and all the others. So I think being aware of these internal and often automatic processes of translation that we engage in our daily lives, this draws attention to the fact that language is not a fixed and given entity that's frozen in time, because there is no such thing as pure language. And I think that's sort of the first step towards when you begin translating, is to be aware of that. Because this is so central to the task of literary translation between languages, which often put us translators in front of difficult choices. So for example, in the Indian context, if you have, say, medieval vernacular Hindi poetry, which is translated into English, for example, for a Western publisher, the question comes up as to what kind of English do you use? Do you use what would be sort of contemporary Indian English, or do you use something contemporaneous, say, let's, for example, say British Shakespearean English, or do you use something completely different? Like one example would be Arvind Krishna Mehrotra's translations of the songs of Kabir for New York Review of Books, for which he used what he felt was the equivalent sort of American slang or Americanese. So in his translations, you have phrases or sentences like, death already has you by the balls, or there's mention of aftershave or the extra chromosome, which are clearly not literal translations. I doubt that the chromosomes feature in Kabir's originals. I'd like to quote at this point A.K. Ramanujan, who said many helpful and wonderful things about translation. And one of them is, he wrote that anyone translating a poem into a foreign language is at the same time trying to translate a foreign reader into a native one. So the concern of translation is not just aesthetic, I think. It's not just about whether a translation is shoddy or beautiful. Ramanujan's point is crucial because it brings us to this third element involved in translation. You have the original text, and you have the translator and the translated text, and you have the readership. So, and this is very important to remember because literature it constructs the social, and so translation as a vehicle for literature constructs the social, and by extension, potentially the national as well. So literature becomes a sensitive tool, and it has the potential to be either creative or revolutionary in sort of ideal case scenarios, but it can also be manipulative and ideological. There are a number of examples of that in India alone. For example, when you have certain sort of Hindu nationalist groups who translate Sanskrit words like Viman, which would refer to divine vehicle, as aeroplane to prove that ancient India had aeronautics. And then a number of other examples that could be mentioned here. So I just mentioned this to come to this idea of sort of what is ethical in translation, especially with regard to when you translate into English, which is what I do. And often it is considered sort of problematic to be involved in English translation. Just yesterday there was the panel on Bhasha and whether it's being subsumed by English. Because on the one hand there's the argument that English, by translating into English and thereby sort of increasing the presence of English works, you're aiding monolingualism by making the study and dissemination of other languages less relevant, less important, because they're available in English. And then there's the flip side of that argument that that says that, well, by in translating into English, you also, in fact, strengthen this pluralism in the world, because you are giving writers in all languages the opportunity to reach English's global audience, which undeniably exists, even though continuing to allow writers to use their native languages and not forcing anyone to write in just one language by providing them this possibility of translation. So these are just some general points that I wanted to start out with. I have a few examples that I would later like to talk about in terms of my own translation, but maybe we could just start with that.
I was hoping that you would talk more about your own experience, but then let's hope we have the time after the next
Yeah,
speaker.
sure, I'd love to get into that.
Vajpeyi, would you like to take the mic next?
You know, as a writer and as a human being, I think I must publicly express my deep gratitude to the act of translation. But for translation, this world would not have been what it is, neither for me nor for many of us. So, Octavio Paz famously said that we are living in a century, and he was, of course, in the 20th century. He said that we are not only translating literary works, we are translating lifestyles. We are translating cuisines, etc. Now, as you know, we have been doing this. So the first point I want to make is that without translation, many of us would not have been the kind of writers we became. Now, I became, you know, we have a word in Sanskrit, Professor Sharma would know, Dvij, which means the second born. I think the translation is the third born, because you have the original work, which is interpreted in various ways by a readership, so that is the second life of the work. And there's the third life of the work, which is translation. Some of us are lucky to have had our works. Trija, yeah. And some of us have the good fortune of having been translated. So I was living in that comfort until a Polish girl came to Delhi University and one day rang me up saying that I have looked into a book of your poems and I think it would be worthwhile to translate that into Polish. Now, can I come and see you? I said, yes, of course. She has been told that I'm a very arrogant person, I don't see anybody, and that I will scold and this, that, and the other, but she came and found me very congenial, etc. When she translated, I happened to be a vice chancellor at that time, so I was visiting Poland and the book was released. And then it occurred to me that I had been great admirer of Polish poetry, and I sincerely think, having read world poetry for about 30 years now, that some of the best poetry in the world in the second part of the 20th century has been written in Polish. I said, but why haven't I tried to translate that into Hindi? But I don't know Polish. So I told this girl, now you know Hindi, I know Hindi, but you know Polish, which I don't. And we are not taking recourse to the English versions. Polish poetry has been very well translated into English. So we said, you are going to tell me a rough Hindi, something we'll work together, and then we'll convert that into a poem. And what we will do is, we'll keep this, we cannot possibly create the same rhythm because Hindi has different rhythm, Polish has different rhythm. We cannot replicate the structure. We decided just to have the lines as a restriction. If there are 23 lines in the original, the Hindi version will also have 23 lines. So that's a practical way out. Then there is a lot of, which was referred to by Professor here, that there are a lot of those connotations. In case of Czesław Miłosz, who was a Nobel laureate, there was a reference to a lot of Christian church details. Now it was very difficult to translate them. So I left those poems, because there's no point in trying to make them come alive in Hindi. But while translating, I became aware of a number of words in Hindi which otherwise I would not have come across. Because I had to look for a word, and I started looking and finding that word which was lying buried somewhere. So translation is not merely expanding the geography of your literature, it is also expanding the geography of your own language. Because then the language tries to go into those areas which it may have never been before. And that, I think, is what makes us so grateful to the act of translation. I mean, it has been much said, and of course the title also, poetry is what is lost in translation. To which Octavio Paz replied, poetry is what survives translation. So in spite of whatever may you have left out, this, that, and the other, after all, let us not forget, we would have never known Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or Thomas Mann or Rainer Maria Rilke, these great figures, Paul Celan, etc., but for translation. So translation is something which has made us the kind of human beings and the kind of writers that we have all become. So thank you, translation, wherever you are.
Thank you very much. That was very heartening for all of us translators and all of you who are aspiring or already are translators, which is, again, a very reassuring thought, because may I just take 1 minute to share with them something I read yesterday. There is a publication called Publishers Weekly, and the editors of that weekly, Stephen Sparks and Chad Post, they have made a list of the 20 best books in translation from world literature, mind you, and they're not taking into account any of the very, very well-known famous names, like Marquez or, none of the big names, all right, or Pamuk, etc. I was absolutely dejected and almost in tears when I saw they had books from Chinese, Japanese, German, 2 from Spanish, 2 from Portuguese, Hebrew, Arabic, 2 from Arabic, Norwegian, Swedish, Persian, Hungarian, Polish, French, Catalan, and Croatian. It made me so sad that we have such a ancient tradition of literary writing in India. Our bhashas produce some of the best works comparable to anyone. And there are no translations available to anybody from our languages. Isn't it something to be really sad about? If it's such an enriching experience, why aren't we doing more of it? Is something I would like to ask. Sorry for this interruption, Bhavana. It's your turn now.
I have been listening to the co-panelists, and everybody has a different story. I think there are 2 kinds of translators. One who only translates, and one who is a writer and also translates. And let me tell you that the writer who translates, it's much more difficult, because when you are a writer yourself and you have a style, you have to constantly hold back and just get soaked into the copy that you're translating. For me, the experience has been a kind of an extraordinary experience. I never wanted to be a translator, just in the way I never wanted to be a writer. I'm an accidental writer. I write about cinema. I'm a film critic. I have been writing on cinema for over 30 years, and I've written 12 books. But when I did my 8th book, somebody sent me an audio book of a Gujarati book, and I heard that, and I just heard it for 5 seconds, and I said to myself, I'm going to translate this into English. I am born into a Gujarati family, but I have not studied Gujarati, so I am not familiar with the script. I can just read the basic alphabets and words strung together. It so happened that the author was visiting Mumbai. I met her. I told her, I'm interested in translating the book that she had written called Krishna Allen, which is on Lord Krishna. And the plot was very interesting. It's about Lord Krishna is in his last moments. He's sitting under the tree and reflecting on his relationships with the women in his life, which is the wife, the beloved, the girlfriend. That's it. So when I told her that I would translate the book, she was very flattered. But as I started reading the book to translate, I realized that I was completely incompetent because I have no vocabulary of the language. She said that she would be accessible to me for any word, meaning that I need help for. But these are very boring things, and after a point, the author gets irritated. So what I did was I bought 10 copies of the book, and I distributed it amongst my sisters' in-laws, everybody who's familiar with Gujarati. I would read one chapter and highlight every word I did not understand. And let me tell you, it was a full page with highlighted green and orange. And after their husbands had gone to work, I would ring them up and ask them over the phone. And most of them are Gujarati medium educated women who would explain to me in tuta futa Gujarati the English word that they thought it was. And I would write down on the textbook whatever English I thought of. And that's how I did chapter by chapter. And in the evening, I would go to the Krishna temple and I would tell Lord Krishna that I've taken this mammoth task, which I'm not meant for because it's very, very uncomfortable, but I don't want to give up. So you come into my heart, you come into my hand, and you write this book for me. And I believe to this day that I have not translated this book. Lord Krishna has translated it for me. And it is not a minor coincidence that Lord Krishna was the 8th child of his parents. I am the 8th child of my parents. I did this book in 2008, and it was my 8th book. Just before I end, I would like to read just one small paragraph from the book. I have to say that I went through my regular teething problems while translating, and at some point, the arrogance of the writer just took over. I could not be devoted to translator, and I said that she did it the way she thought it was, and I am going to be fair to her, dignified to her creativity, but I am going to give it my voice. And the original has 3 women, that is Rukmani, Radha and Draupadi, that Krishna is attached to and keeps talking about. But there is the youngest wife of Krishna who is dark, sensuous, attractive, attention-seeking, spontaneous, impulsive, and I just fell in love with her. So I made it very, very subtly, the story of 4 women. I'm going to read a very, very small para, which is about Gandhari, Dhritarashtra's wife. When Krishna, after the Kurukshetra is over, and Krishna goes to her, and Krishna is upset because the 100 Kauravas are dead, and Gandhari hates Krishna at that moment. You will die like a beast, alone and in anguish. Mata Gandhari had cursed Krishna when he had gone to meet her after the battle of Kurukshetra. He could never forget her heart-wrenching voice. It was reminiscent of Yashoda's outcry when many years ago Krishna departed from Gokul. Probably it was the universal anguish of a mother parting with her son. Perhaps they all sounded the same in every century, in every avatar. Gandhari had said, I have lost 99 sons. My feet are still soiled from the blood that spurted out of Duryodhana's injured thigh. I'm exhausted of cleansing my feet again and again. The sight of Dushasan's hacked arms fallen apart from his body wake me up, startled. At midnight even now, Krishna, you did not do justice. There's one small one, and then I hand over the mic. And this is of a favorite character of mine, Radha. Radha and Krishna parted with each other when they were just 16. I mean, she was 16 or lesser. And then they never met. Whenever you feel sad, lonely, or confused, think of me. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and you will sense me beside you. I never let you out of my sight, but you've determined to leave without me. But I follow you to your isolation, become a part of your reflection, your seclusion. Just remember, there is no escape from me because I'm your subconscious. And it's not possible for you to ever distance yourself from your memories. I'm a part of you, residing inside you. All you have is to inhale and call me out. See, I'm already beside you. Thank you.
Well, for those skeptics who say that translations don't read smooth and they are awkward and they just have to read this to know that you can produce a translation which is as creative, as moving as the original. Thank you, Bhavana, for that. I have about 10 minutes more. I wonder if the audience has any questions for the panelists. Please feel free to ask anything that is bothering you and anything that you... Okay, just one moment, please.
Yeah, Saskya, I want to know, did you at any time while translating felt that you wanted to give it up? Or did you get irritated? Because I think it's a very selfless job. You know, after all the translation that you do, it's called a translation. When it is never a translation, it is a transcreation. Did these kind of thoughts go into your mind?
Well, I mean, you're very right about the fact that translation, and I think that touches on what you, Keerti, mentioned as well, sort of the translation is always considered not rewarding, or it's also not rewarded enough in the sense that translators are often not paid a lot, so people can't live off of translation, which is why lots of translators also have other jobs and also write other things. In terms of whether or not I was close to giving up at some point, it didn't really come quite to that point because I was in the fortunate position that I was working very closely with the author. Because the book that I translated is a book of nonfiction. It's a book on German theater and performance theory, and it goes into performance history. The author of the book is a very eminent German performance scholar. So we worked very closely on different aspects of the book. We did run into quite a few challenges and problems, especially because by translating this book, as nonfiction books do, they refer to a lot of other books. And so we looked up sort of translations of books that she had referred to in the original that were then translated into English. And we ran into a few problems there because they were already translated and you can't really change them, and still you have to work with what you have. So one main example that I would like to bring here was a work by Walter Benjamin, the famous German thinker and critic. And in one of the translations that had been done of his work into English for an American publisher, they had mistranslated something, or rather they had chosen to change a metaphor or not use a metaphor. So in the German, in the original, Benjamin speaks of breathing landscape. And in the original that the translator, as in the translation that the American translator did, I'll just read that one line. He changes that word. So the sentence goes, if, while resting on a summer afternoon, you follow with your eyes a mountain range on the horizon, or a branch which casts its shadow over you, you experience the aura of those mountains, of that branch. While in the original, so he uses the word experience, but in the original, Benjamin had said you breathe the aura of that mountain. And the whole point she was making, the author was making and in that chapter was about sort of experiencing physicality. She talks a lot about sort of the effect of performance. And so it was one of those things where you just kind of want to tear your hair out because you have to work with this and you can't, I mean, of course you could retranslate the whole thing, but in a certain non-fiction context that it's more advisable to use what you have. And so there are things like that where you kind of, you're dependent on translations that have already been done that are not exactly accurate, especially in a language like German, which is on the one hand quite precise and accurate, but on the other hand also more poetic than English is, for example. So maybe the translator of the American text thought that it would baffle an English reader to use the word breathe in landscape rather than experience, which might be a little more descriptive.
So that is exactly what I meant when I said the translation was a creative process itself. Professor Vajpeyi has to say something, sorry.
I just wanted to say that if you are a creative writer and you are translating also, your creative writing starts getting influenced by your translation. So some critic pointed out when a new book of my poems came that now Ashok Vajpeyi seemed to have entered a Polish phase. Because I was translating so much Polish poetry that perhaps unconsciously that came into me. The other thing, we seem to take English versions as always very competent. What happens in case of Joshua Mibosh, his authorized translation in English had images which are very concise in the original Polish, expanded. And images which are very expanded, concised. Yeah. And it is authorized by the... So what do? Right in the beginning, we are not going to look into the English versions. We will abide by the original Polish. And of course, I have to abide by that girl's sort of interpretation. But when the translation, Szymborska released her own book, she was the other Nobel laureate, and she released the book in Krakow, and she listened in wonder. Just as some of us have listened to our translation in Arabic or Chinese or French or German in wonder, because you don't understand what the deuce is happening. And at the end of it, she says, I don't know this language, but I hope I could feel the music of that language. And if in the translation there is music, there must be sense in the translation.
Well, that answers beautifully one question that I had raised. Yes. Just one moment. About translation, how do you evaluate a translation? This is one parameter, I think, if you can hear the music in it. Yes.
Yes, I come from Kathmandu, and I have a comment and a question. The first comment has some geopolitical dimensions in relation to translation. Because Nepal was not formally colonized, we don't have that English language category in our middle or upper classes. As a result, most of the discourse in Nepal, including in the present day, the political discourse is in Nepali. So, and there is no translation going on. I give you an example of the Supreme Court judgments in Nepal are all in Nepali, unlike Supreme Court judgments in any other country of South Asia. So what happens is the world begins to think that Nepal does not have really jurisprudence worthy the name. And one of the reasons that our current politics is being denigrated is because the world thinks that we are probably a country without a jurisprudence. That is because of lack of translations from Nepali into English, even in the particular sphere of jurisprudence. But I would like to, my question has to do with the other direction of translation from a world language, particularly English, into Nepali. We have lost out in terms of the Kathmandu intelligentsia, if you will, or the Nepali intelligentsia, being alert to the run of writings, fiction and non-fiction, that is available, because in Nepal, till the 60s, it was okay to read Hindi, but then our ultra-nationalism took over. So you are locked away from Hindi, you don't know English, so you're left with reading your contemporaries in Nepali and reading each other without the kind of injection. So my question to you, gentlemen, ladies, would be, we've heard of a decided, planned translation movement in Thailand and in Japan over the last century. Are there any societies in South Asia, and I don't talk of big Hindi, but any societies in South Asia that have decided we really now need to get translated so we can get that injection of ideas from the world into our vernacular? Thank you.
Well, I don't know whether I'm exactly answering your question, but Anantmurthy and I have been pursuing at the level of the Prime Minister, Prime Ministers really, because we did not succeed with a Prime Minister. We seem to have succeeded with the second one. The idea that we should have an organization, an autonomous organization, properly funded, which translates works from Indian languages into world languages, not merely English, but Spanish and German and French and Arabic and Japanese and Chinese, etc. It was called ILA. I thought that would attract the previous Prime Minister, Indian literature abroad. He promised, but he did not do it. Now this one has done it. So there is a project, Indian literature abroad. And there's a committee looking after it. We have identified 40 books and things of that kind. And they're being offered. And what we want is translators from those languages to do it rather than somebody in India knowing it. Maybe preliminary translation could be done, but it should be done by a proper translator and should have been published by a proper publisher in that language. That is one. The other thing I was going to point out, there's a small place called Piparia, which is not even a tehsil town. It's a station on some obscure rail line. And there's a young man there called Vanshi Maheshwari, who's a cloth merchant. But he decided that he is going to publish a journal in Hindi devoted only to translation of poetry. More than 100 issues of that journal have come out, each one containing translations from some language or the other of the world or of India. Now, these are kinds of people doing things, and he keeps on urging people to translate. So there are both these kinds of efforts. But surely, much more needs to be done. Translation in India does not enjoy the kind of prestige is enjoyed in the West. Translation is thought to be, like you were saying, that if you are not capable of writing yourself, you translate, in the sense. But we are not those writers. We are all capable of writing whatever we want to, howsoever badly. But we take to translation because, as I said, it is important to enrich your language, important to enrich your literature, and important to enrich your consciousness of the world in which you happen to be alive and hopefully kicking.
Thank you very much. Much as I would like to ask you if you have any more questions, I believe we are behind schedule. So I'd have to say thank you very much to my panelists. Yes. Yes, I was just going to say that. If you have any questions, we are all around. You can always approach us with your specific questions and we'll be very happy to answer them. And please do visit the bookshop because copies of the translations are available over there. I'm sure it would be a rewarding purchase for you. Thank you very much for being such a good audience.